Hey guys, it's Serena and welcome to my video where I'll be explaining resting, local, and action potential. So a resting membrane potential is when a neuron is at rest and is capable of sending a signal down to its length when it is ready. So a neuron uses sodium/potassium pumps to continually make sure that the sodium ion exists in a higher concentration in the ECF and that the potassium ion exists in a higher concentration in the ICF. So sodium and potassium are both positive, but the potassium ion and the ICF contend with the negatively charged proteins, which means that the ECF has a positive nature to it and the ICF has a negative nature to it. So in addition, the ECF is more positive due to the diffusion of potassium ion to some degree through the plasma membrane. This difference on the two sides of the plasma membrane means an electrical potential exists at the membrane, called the resting membrane potential, which leads to a negative 70 millivolts value for the ICF while the neuron is in this ready/at-rest state. The fact that the ICF has a value of a negative 70 millivolt tells us that the membrane has specifically achieved its resting membrane potential. In this state, the membrane is said to be in a polarized state. While at rest, the neuron's sodium gates and potassium gates are closed, which means that the pumps are transporting sodium ions out and the potassium ions in, and they are largely staying when they have been pumped. For the sodium ions perspective, they find themselves in a crowded, positively charged fluid. Because of this, the sodium ion has a strong attraction for the ICF. There are fewer sodium ion there and it is negatively charged. But the pumps in the closed states of the sodium gates mean that the sodium ions cannot diffuse into the ICF yet. Local potential is a short-range change in the voltage along the plasma membrane. The opening of the sodium gates and the diffusion of the sodium ions into the ICF at the state of the stimulation causes neighboring sodium gates to open as well. This kind of signal is called a local potential. They are produced by gated channels on the dendrites and the soma. Local potential have the following characteristic. Number 1, graded, meaning that they vary in magnitude depending on the strength of the stimulus. The more stimulation that occurs, the more sodium channel will open and the more sodium ion will enter the ICF, depolarizing the membrane to a greater degree. Number 2, decremental, meaning that the current gets weaker the further away from the site of the stimulation it gets. Number 3, they are reversible, meaning that if the stimulation stops, the membrane will return to its resting membrane potential. This is due to the fact that the sodium gates will close again without stimulation and the pumps can return the sodium ions to the ECF. The axon hillock and the axon beyond has 7 to 10 times the number of sodium and potassium gates as the dendrites and the soma do, and if a local potential is strong enough, when it reaches the hillock, it can trigger a much more dramatic change in the polarity and the membrane potential. This stronger, more rapid disturbance is called an action potential. So, action potential is a more dramatic change in the state of the plasma membrane. It can occur at the axon hillock and along the axon's length. So how they differ from local potential. 1, they follow the all or none law. So if the local potential that reaches the hillock is strong enough to trigger an action potential, the action potential will occur at full strength. If not, no action potential will occur. So action potential are not graded. 2, they are non-decremental, meaning that the action potential maintain their full strength down the entire length of the axon, regardless of distance. And 3, they are irreversible. Once the action potential starts, it cannot be stopped. To understand the process of action potential, we will consider the state of the gates, the corresponding movement of cations, the measure value of the membrane potential, and the state of the membrane. So the local potential at the axon hillock is strong enough to cause a current that depolarizes the membrane to its threshold value, which is negative 55 millivolts. So then the sodium gates open and the sodium ions rapidly diffuse from the ECF to the ICF, causing the membrane potential to rapidly depolarize from negative 55 millivolts through 0 millivolts and eventually to positive 35 millivolts. And then next, the sodium gates close and the potassium gates open, causing the potassium ion to rapidly diffuse from the ICF to the ECF. The membrane potential now rapidly repolarized as the existing cation caused the membrane potential to become more negative and eventually returning to negative 70 millivolts. Lastly, the potassium gates closed, and now with both gates closed, the sodium and potassium pumps can return the cation to their original location. And then here you have a graph that shows you what I've explained earlier on in the video about resting membrane potential, local potential, and action potential.